Hey everybody, we're MCtheProfessor.GOV. Yeah, do it.
Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Intellectual history is the study of thought, the study of ideas. And today I want to talk a little bit about the intellectual history of this, the civilization-savagery dichotomy. Here we go. Civilization and savagery, the racial ideologies of American settler colonialism and imperialism. Okay, so, here's the thing about studying ideas. A lot of people think it's not worthwhile to study ideas. I happen to think that it is. I realize that it is very important for us to study the material realities that underlay our world, but we also must understand the language and the analytical frameworks that help to justify those material realities and perpetuate them, perhaps more so than everyone thinks. So here's what I'm going to ask you. This is sort of the baseline question. What analytical frameworks and ways of thinking have historically shaped settler colonialism and imperialism? Begin from this. There are two kinds of violence that have shaped the United States throughout its history, and those two kinds of violence are as follows. There is the violent expropriation of indigenous lands, and then there is the violent exploitation of black bodies to extract wealth from that expropriated land. Okay? These are sort of the two basic material forces that shape the United States from its inception. And while we can talk about all the reasons why that happened, and all the methods used to carry out this program, I'm interested in the intellectual justification. And so we're going to take a look at some of the thought that underpins and justifies these two particular kinds of violence. This is our primary sort of thing we're going to be playing with. Something called civilizational hierarchy, also called the civilization-savagery dichotomy. This is the essential framework that underpins these two forms of violence. And we have to begin by understanding the language here. Think about how we use the word civilized. I teach high school, and every year I ask my students what their associations with the word civilized are, out of nowhere. And they answer usually three things without prompting. First, they say civilized means peaceful. The second is they say civilized means orderly. They say it's waiting in line at Starbucks and nobody's punching each other. That's what they say civilized means. They also say it means cooperative. Peaceful, orderly, cooperative. Right? But if we dig deeper, and I ask them what civilized looks like and what civilized sounds like, you get slightly different answers. For example, they all mention tea drunk from pots every year. They all mention people who are overdressed and who basically are Victorian, right? Lots of clothes, starch, and British accents. Every year this happens, and I ask them, why is it that you have this association of stuffy, late 19th century British people with the word civilized? Anyone know? Colonialism, right, correct, yeah. Okay, we understand. Now, the other word, this is sort of the thing they end up describing. Now, the other word here, savage, right? I've got some pictures from the 2011 Vancouver riots over that hockey game. Savage, when I ask them what savage means, we tend to get violent, we get chaotic, we get selfish, right? And moreover, we get animalistic, right? We get atavistic, sort of reverting back to some kind of previous time in history, and we get anachronistic. Savagery does not belong now, it belongs in the past, right? That's what we get out of this. Even though their vision of civilized is 130 years old. I don't know. What is important about these two words is that civilization and savagery are mutually generative concepts, which means they require one another to exist. They are each other's counter definition. That which is civilized is that which is not savage, and vice versa, right? That makes sense, right? And this brings us to the idea of civilizational hierarchy. Hierarchy. This is the idea that civilization and savagery are constructed as two extremes of a spectrum, right? That you go from absolutely savage to absolutely civilized, and all people and cultures and countries and things fall somewhere sprinkled in the interim. And what this means is that all things that fall on the savage side of the spectrum are atavistic and anachronistic and do not belong in the now, and have to be brought into the side of civilization, have to be made civilized. It's like this. You have savagery, everyone begins in savagery, and you advance into civilization, right? And theoretically, this moves with history. We start with savagery, we move to civilization, right? That's the idea. Except, because of the way that we use these words, not everybody in the now gets to be part of civilization. There is, for example, this idea that some people did not follow the track of history to civilization, but instead remained in the realm of the savage, and are thus people who do not belong in time. Critical theorist Talal Assad has an idea, a metaphor that he uses to describe liberalism, which I will now apply here to this. And that is the idea that civilization is a garden. It is a garden, a world of savagery. Savagery is the encroaching jungle. It is the past, it's violence, it's disorder, it's the thing that our society organizes to prevent. And if you think about civilization as the garden in the encroaching jungle, it means that civilization is always in danger. And how do you address that danger? How do you address the danger of the encroaching jungle, of disorder? What did President Nixon say in 1968? Don't you want law and order? Well, how do you get order? How do you fight off the savagery? You do it with violence. You do it with violence. Around the time of the American Civil War, something was changing. For hundreds of years, direct violence had been used to expropriate the land of American Indian people. And by the 1860s, this hundreds-year-long war was beginning to wind down. In 1862, denied the ability to roam freely on the plains, and left with annuities payments that were being not delivered so that food could not be purchased, the Dakota people in Minnesota rose up against the United States government and began to attack white settlements. And after a whole lot of bloodshed, they lost. Over 1,600 Dakota non-combatants were rounded up and brought to Fort Snelling and put in what is America's first modern internment camp, where of course many did not make it through the long winter. This camp was constructed in December. As for those who had fought in the Dakota Wars, we had the largest mass hanging in American history, where 38 Dakota men were hanged on this device specifically designed for the occasion. They were 38 of 303 condemned to die for the uprising. Now, once this war was over, it sparked a series of other conflicts in the plains that are known as the Indian Wars, or the last Indian Wars, the final period of time when military force was used as a way to prevent the encroachment of the state upon indigenous peoples in the plains. But as early as 1869, the federal government was concocting a new plan. Complete genocide was no longer going to be necessary because those who remained on the plains were going to be civilized. President Grant put together something called the peace policy. President Grant put together something called the peace policy, where essentially he said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put people onto the reservations where, people are trying to escape from the reservations. And we're going to force, quote-unquote, Western culture upon them. And this culture was made up of a few very important components. The English language and Christianity, private property, an ending of the treaty system, and taxation and citizenship. And if these objectives were able to be forced upon the indigenous peoples of the plains, you wouldn't have to shed any more blood. It was considered a more humane option. Cultural genocide. Well, how do you do this? In 1877, Congress passes the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act was rooted in the idea that communally owned property is savage and privately owned property is civilized. That is the civilized way to be, not only to be a sedentary farmer, but to own your own land. And collectively owned land was a thing of the past. So what does it do? They divide the reservation land into 160-acre plots, and they dole them out to American Indian families, seemingly an innocuous plan, but this was actually designed to destroy the quote-unquote tribal bond, which was considered an element of savagery. Not only did this break up the communities of the people of the plains, but on top of that, overall, it dramatically reduces the land holdings of those people. So for example, at the time of the Dawes Act's passage, 138 million acres were still controlled by Plains Indians in the western states. By the time the Dawes Act was finally rescinded as an absolute failure, which is what it was, and by the time the reservation system was reinstated in 1934, 138 million acres became 47 million acres. Today, that's merely 10. It's nearly all gone. If you want to hold a claim to Western land as an American Indian person now, you have to base it upon an ancestor you had who got land through the program in 1887. And that means every 160-acre plot has literally thousands of people who can claim it. This has eviscerated the value of the land. leaves us with the broken reservation system we have today. Oh. Things are gonna get weird now. See that? Now there's something else going on here though. This was not going to be enough. Because leaders like Sitting Bull and Red Cloud did not accept the Dawes Act. And they ordered their people to go back onto the plains and to roam as they always had, right? Following the buffalo, which was the central food source of people of the plains. What do you do about that? Systematic attempts were made to exterminate the buffalo on the plains. If there were no buffalo, you would have to move onto these plots, learn how to farm, and that'd be it. This is exactly what was done. And we see a thriving buffalo market throughout the late 19th century. Crazy amounts of money were made on this. They had Western train rides where you could get on a train and go through the Western territories and kill as many buffalo as possible for sport, which they got East Coast people who were very excited about the Wild West sort of thing to go out and do this as a way of exterminating the buffalo. And by the 1890, 1891, there were virtually no buffalo left, several hundred, and that was it. And all the buffalo alive today are survivors of those last few hundred. And you know the story of what happens to the amount of land controlled by American Indian people over this period. Now what about English and what about Christianity? While the parents were dealing with the seizure of their land, indigenous youth were separated from their families forcibly and sent to boarding schools that were mandatory, where you had to dress in a Western style, had to speak English at risk of violence, and had to practice Christianity. Had to cut your hair, everything was policed. And people were trained in trades considered useful so they could go out and get employment in the cities, where of course they could not find jobs because what they encountered was racial prejudice. By the way, if you're into the NFL, you must know the NFL's, before it was called that, the first president of the NFL, of course, was Jim Thorpe, who attended Carlisle Indian Industrial School, and who died a miserable alcoholic, having had his Olympic medal stripped from him and only returned after he died. And he spoke about what these schools did to him psychologically, and it wasn't pretty. Schools were modeled on Carlisle, and Carlisle was founded by a guy named Captain Richard Pratt, and his philosophy can be summed up in one famous quote of his, which is, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." That in order to save the humanity of American Indian people, you have to destroy every element of the culture that defines them. I will read you a quote of his. "For many years," this is Richard Pratt speaking, "for many years we greatly oppressed the black man." He's making a comparison here. "But the germ of human liberty remained among us and grew until, in spite of our irregularities, there came from the lowest savagery into intelligent manhood the freedom among us more than 7 millions of our population, who are today an element of industrial value with which we could not well dispense. Horrible as were the experiences of its introduction and of slavery itself, there was concealed in them the greatest blessing that ever came to the Negro race, 7 millions of blacks from cannibalism in darkest Africa to citizenship in free and enlightened America. Not full, not complete citizenship, but possible, probable citizenship, and on the highway and near to it." I don't have to explain to you what's wrong with that. But what we notice is that Richard Pratt operated from this idea that everyone comes from savagery and must be brought into civilization, and the only way this can be done is through violence. President Chester Arthur speaking about the Dawes Act, said a resort to the allotment system, or the Dawes Act, would have a direct and powerful influence in dissolving the tribal bond, which is so prominent a feature of savage life, and which tends so strongly to perpetuate it. He later said it was natural at a time when the national territory seemed almost illimitable and contained many millions of acres far outside the bounds of civilized settlements, that a policy should have been initiated which more than aught else has been the fruitful source of our Indian complications. I refer, of course, to the policy of dealing with the various Indian tribes as separate nationalities, of regulating them by treaty stipulations to the occupancy of immense reservations in the West, and of encouraging them to live a savage life, undisturbed by any earnest and well-directed efforts to bring them under the influences of civilization. Bring them under the influences of civilization. By violence. Look what he says. The Indians must conform to the white man's ways, peaceably if they will, forcibly if they must, and indeed they must. This was John Oberle, who was tasked with addressing the quote-unquote Indian problem. There were alternative voices. Charles Alexander Eastman, also known as Owiesa. He was a refugee from the Dakota Wars as a child and grew up to be the first American Indian to graduate from Harvard with a doctorate and become a medical doctor. And he also wrote a book of American history from a Plains perspective. And in it he says this: in effect, the European who came among us said this: you are a child. You cannot make or invent anything. We have the only God, and he has given us authority to teach and to govern all the peoples of the earth. In proof of this, we have his book, a supernatural guide, every word of which is true and binding. We are a chosen people, a superior race, and have a heaven with golden gates fenced in from all pagans and unbelievers, and a hell where the souls of such are tortured eternally. We are honorable, truthful, refined, religious, peaceful. We hate cruelty and injustice. Our business is to educate, Christianize, and protect the rights and property of the weak and the uncivilized. Owiesa could see right through the garbage that was being fed to the American public and his own people in the late 19th century. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this process of civilization, of forcing private property in English and Christianity and Western ways upon American Indian people, was seen as inevitable. The inevitable march of history forward to civilization. It was seen as moral, a moral necessity. You are required to bring people into civilization, otherwise they will live in savagery, and what a tragedy that would be. And it was seen as a legitimate grounds for coercion and violence. You add to the savagery, civilizing violence, and this is how you attain civilization. Now here's the question. When the plains were won, what happens to this ideology? In 1898, the United States waged war against the Spanish Empire. When it did this, it interrupts two very important freedom movements: an existing war in Cuba against the Spanish, led by Cuban independence leaders, and a budding independence movement in the Philippines, also controlled by the Spanish at the time. By the end of 1898, the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and Hawaii had all fallen necks beneath the heel of the American Empire. And what was done with these new colonial possessions and their people? Look what we have here. Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Philippines, being educated in the American classroom by Uncle Sam while the states look on. And something you will notice is that they are all the same color, despite the fact that these are multi-ethnic, multiracial, highly diverse countries. All the same color. And What is that color? It's savage. These people were called savage. The Cuban independence movement was called savage. The Filipino independence movement was called savage. By the way, in the Philippines, when the Americans gracefully freed them from Spanish rule, what happened? The Filipino independence movement stepped up, declared the first Philippine Republic, and said, we are our own country now. And the Americans said, no, you are not, and waged a 3-year-long war that involved the murder of 200,000 Filipino civilians. 200,000 non-combatants murdered in the name of civilizing the Philippines. In the century that I was born. And we're all familiar with this. We're all familiar, of course, with the idea that the white nations of the world have to carry the uncivilized into civilization. All of you have read Kipling. You all know about the white man's burden. You've all heard this before. But maybe you don't know this guy. Albert Beveridge, an American senator and imperialist. The opposition tells us we ought not to govern a people without their consent. I answer, the rule of liberty that all just government derives its authority from the consent of the governed applies only to those who are capable of self-government. We govern the Indians without their consent. We govern our territories without their consent. We govern our children without their consent. Would not the people of the Philippines prefer the just, humane, civilizing government of this republic to the savage, bloody rule of pillage from which we have rescued them? From which we have rescued them. How about Josiah Strong? Another marked characteristic of the Anglo-Saxon is what may be called an instinct or genius for colonizing. His unequaled energy, his indomitable perseverance, and his personal independence made him a pioneer. He excels all others in pushing his way into new countries. It was those in whom this tendency was strongest that came to America. And this inherited tendency has been further developed by the westward sweep of successive generations across the continent. Strong recognized that the conquest of the American West was a prelude to global conquest. Then will the world enter upon a new stage of its history, the final competition of the races for which the Anglo-Saxon is being schooled. Long before the 1,000 millions are here, the mighty centrifugal tendency inherent in this stock and strengthened in the United States will assert itself. And then this race of unequaled energy with all the majesty of numbers and might of wealth behind it, the representative, let us hope, of the largest liberty, the purest Christianity, the highest civilization, having developed peculiarly aggressive traits calculated to impress its institutions upon mankind, will spread itself over the earth. Some people said Anglo-Saxons are superior because of biology. Others said Anglo-Saxons are superior because of culture. These are functionally the same. Something to bear in mind. Where does this leave us? 100 years later. Does the civilization hierarchy thesis remain influential today? What happened to this kind of thought? You don't have people saying these things explicitly anymore, really. There are some, but there's not that many. They have other ways of doing it. You might know Gavin McInnes, the Vice guy, that wicked racist guy. He uses the term Western chauvinism. And he says, I'm proud to say that the West has produced the greatest institutions and culture in world history. And a lot of people hear him say that and they go, yeah, all right. Seems legitimate. Whereas anybody who identifies as a Western chauvinist is directly adopting the civilizational hierarchy thesis uncritically. Then there are the sneakier people. There are the people who talk about the Enlightenment. People like Stephen Fry. Y'all know Stephen Fry? I love the Enlightenment. He talks about the Enlightenment all the time. How Europeans in the 1700s produced this unique magisterial philosophy that's universal. And all we have to do is all adopt this unique European magisterial philosophy and system of government. And then we're all freed. What does that sound like? Same deal. Even the paradigm of development. Now that the Cold War is, we can't even talk about that, but we no longer use the term third world and first world so often, but we do talk about development. Developing countries, developed countries. Linear progression. Those that are undeveloped will become developed. Of course, they won't, because they are undeveloped. Because we are developed. Because quote-unquote undeveloped countries are undeveloped because they have been underdeveloped by the West. Not everyone is going to live like Americans do. That is a myth. And that is a myth that is an extension, ideologically, of civilizational hierarchy. So this is what I have to say to you about this. We have to be critical of our intellectual inheritance. Everybody knows that it was wrong. Everybody knows it was wrong to wage war on the Dakota in the 1860s. People generally know the Dawes Act was probably not a very good idea. People generally know that the white supremacist American imperialist rhetoric that underpinned our foreign policy in the early 20th century wasn't great. And yet, if you ignore the ways that we inherit those legacies, both discursively and materially, you render yourself ill-equipped to combat these tendencies and the ways in which this violence persists on through this day. Do not forget that 2018 America only exists because of late 19th century America. Do not forget the fact that we continue to profit off the stolen land. Do not forget the fact that violence created this land and this world order, and that violence sustains this land and this world order. But you cannot know the ways in which this is so unless you realize the continuities between the ways people used to talk and the ways people talk today. Anytime you hear people talking about this stuff, it's worth a conversation. As ever, I don't really know what to do about this. This is just something I think about a lot. I know what to tell you. If you figure it out, let me know. But in the meantime, if anyone is like talking about how everything's going to go in one direction and then we're going to get to this utopic thing where it's all, that's what it is, and it happens to be exactly what we are right now, there's something fishy about that. Hear what I'm saying? Because a world created through violence against others cannot be made universal. A world created through violence against the other cannot be made universal. We've been MCtheProfessor.GOV. Like us on Facebook, talk to us afterwards. Book us for your next birthday party. See y'all later.